I'm going to talk about India, but back to China. Just one point to emphasize. I don't think I didn't spell this out clearly enough right at the end of my last session, but I'll spell it out now. And if any of you have any questions or observations on China, let's say 5 minutes on China before I get started on India, but only if you have anything to follow up on. The point is this: in that reform and opening era I talked about, I think the paramount economic objective was to have maximum growth. And that objective, in order to ensure social stability, and of course the rule of the Communist Party. And that objective drove market-oriented reforms and acted as at least a partial discipline on greater state intervention. Now that's changed under President Xi, because the paramount objective is political control and social control, and with it, more economic intervention. And the paramount objective is, in quotation marks, the national security state. This often comes up in Chinese public statements now. And the leadership consensus, meaning the one-man consensus of President Xi, is that they're willing to sacrifice a little bit of growth in order to maximize political, social, and economic control. And they think that will be enough to ensure social stability. Whether it will be remains to be seen. But that's a profound shift. It's a profound shift not just for China, but also for the rest of the world because of the importance, the weight of China in the rest of the world. So, of course, a China that's growing even slower than it is now means, of course, repercussions for the rest of the world, for countries that export to China, that receive inputs from China, and so on. And it also perhaps increases the risk that social instability in China resulting from lower growth will give even more incentive to the leadership in Beijing to be more aggressively nationalistic in its international relations as a way of distracting domestic attention from local problems, from problems within China. So just think of Taiwan, which is the flashpoint issue of the risk of Beijing doing something, even resorting to an invasion of Taiwan, as a way of emphasizing its nationalist credentials and distracting the Chinese population's worries about their domestic situation. That's really what I wanted to say. Have you got any quick? Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so how do you think the UAE or even the signatories of the Abraham Accords should react to China's move and its new laws regarding their activities?
Israel, the UAE, and the other Abraham Accord countries are certainly not in a position to influence China the way the United States is, or let's say the way the European Union collectively might be. Not that the European Union collectively is very powerful. I personally, I wouldn't have a problem with, if you like, countries in between having a transactional approach to China. There are clearly some benefits from engaging with China. There are commercial benefits to begin with. So the UAE doing that and Israel doing that, I don't think is a problem. The problem is becoming too dependent on China, both economically and also in a security sense. And there are plenty of countries now in what used to be called the Third World that have become too dependent on China, like my own Sri Lanka. Too dependent in terms of debt, too dependent in terms of not having balancing relationships with other countries and other powers, too dependent on things that get to the heart of national security, like, for example, having Huawei do the 5G network for your country. So I wouldn't rely on Huawei as a 5G provider, or certainly as the major provider in the UAE or Israel or anywhere else, because I think that's a national security threat. But dealing with China transactionally, while maintaining and enhancing one's security relationships and commercial relationships with the West and with the US in particular, is okay. No? Okay, right. Anything else? If not, we can move on to India. Just out of interest, how many of you have been to India? I know Maya has over there. Anyone else? Yes? You've been? Yeah. None of the other Israelis before or after your national service? Not India. Haven't been up to Rishikesh to indulge in spirituality and inhaling alternative substances? No? Okay. Right. India. Now, what I'm going to do in this talk is really look at the interplay of liberalism and mercantilism in India, just as I did with China. And there's been a kind of swinging back and forth in India between liberalism and mercantilism. So from independence until 1991, India was a very mercantilist country. Outside the communist bloc, it was the most strictly regulated, certainly large country in the developing world. In a sense, aping what was happening in the Soviet Union in particular. Then came the big reforms. So the pendulum swung in a liberal direction. And it's oscillated between the two, liberalism and mercantilism, since the early 90s until the present. And what we have seen in the last decade under the government of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he runs a one-man show, rather like President Xi in China in some respects, is a swing back towards more mercantilism, more state intervention, which also spills over into more protectionism. So I'll use that frame to look at the following points on this slide. So let me start with a basic snapshot of India in the world economy. Now, this is a famous chart. It comes from Professor Angus Maddison, who looked at long-run economic statistics. And what it basically tells us is that Asia had about 60% of world output, roughly corresponding to its share of the global population, just at the point when the Industrial Revolution was taking off in the early 19th century. And as you see, Asia's share declined to a low of less than 20% of GDP by the mid-20th century, before then increasing. And the projection of Angus Maddison then was that Asia would account for about 50% of world GDP at purchasing power by 2030. That's, I think, already been achieved. So Asia is now closer to its level of the world's population, which is still close to about 60%. Right. So I'll come to you in just a moment. And of course, what this indicates is from the early 19th century to around 1950, Asia didn't industrialize in the way the West did. That era is known as the Great Divergence between the West and the rest, including Asia. What we see post-1950, that Asian recovery, is, of course, the East Asian miracle in particular, starting with Japan and Korea, then the second generation of tigers, then China and Vietnam, and then India, all the way to the present. Yes, go ahead.
The only thing I can't exactly quite get is why do we see a decrease in the GDP in Asia between 1820 to 1973? It's in percentage?
Yes, yes. Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's relative. So let's now look at how that splits among the major Asian countries. And of course, the big three in Asia are Japan, China, and India. Dor.
When you say Asia, you mean whole Asia or only the eastern part of Asia?
No, no.
In the Middle East and Turkey and stuff like that?
I think this is the whole of Asia, including the Middle East. Right. So it's East Asia, it's the Southeast Asian archipelago, it's South Asia, and not Russia. South Asia, Central Asia, and then all the way to Western Asia, including the Middle East. Yeah, yeah. In other words, everything east of Greece. So this shows how it splits up among the countries, and I'll focus on India. 1820, India accounted for about 15% of world output. China, of course, much more. That's the red bar. India is the yellow bar. But notice by 1950, and even worse, 1973, India had shrunk to less than 5%, probably about 2 to 3% of world GDP, which was a sign of, mainly a sign of India not partaking of the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, which of course was very much a Western phenomenon until fairly recently. And then what we see since 1973 is a gradual increase in India's share, much more gradual than China's. So China is now close to 20% of world GDP, having started from, well, a not too dissimilar position from India in the early 1970s. India is now maybe hovering around 5%, and maybe by the end of this decade will not be 10%, but say 7-8% of world GDP. So a relative increase, but not as significant an increase as we saw with China. This slide gives us an indication of what's happened in more recent times. So notice, even up until about 1990, India and China had about the same size of economy. China's economy now is more than 3 times bigger than India's economy. But India's economy has still increased considerably by Indian standards. So that's a result of the opening and the globalization of India from the early 1990s. But notice that gap between India and China. Now the projections are, even if India grows, and this is a conservative estimate, if you look at India, population 1.4 plus billion, already the biggest country on earth in terms of population. It's just overtaken China. I think it overtook China in March or April. The projection is India's population will be something like 1.7 billion by 2050, and a little later it'll start to taper off and decline. But it could be, in a generation's time, India's population will be about a third larger than China's population, because China's population will start to decrease fairly quickly. So given that, and given you have, if you like, a youth bulge coming out of India, with the reverse happening in China, it's not unrealistic to project annual growth rates of about 5%. I mean, that's on the conservative side. And if you take that forward, then by 2050, the size of the Indian economy will be about the size of the euro area. Some projections say it'll be the size of the US by 2050. But in any case, the potential is there for the Indian economy to be much, much bigger than it is now, given, if you like, its basic ingredients. A huge population, an ever younger population, which could go into productive economic activity, especially manufacturing, and of course exports. Yeah, so it's, the saying about India could be the saying about Brazil. You know the famous saying about Brazil? Does anyone know the famous saying about Brazil? It's a version of that. Brazil is the Larry.
It's the country of the future, and it always will be.
That's it. Yeah, that's the one. So I don't think India is as bad as that. I think it's got some things going for it that are maybe more promising than Brazil, but still, it's one of those countries that achieves way below its potential.
You asked earlier who visited India.
Yeah.
I didn't know, but I studied in the Indian schools for 10 years. So I very much am in touch with India's culture and how things work. And they have the same problems that they had in the 1990s.
Right.
Exactly same. It's just repeating itself again and again. So, like you said, they never fulfill the
Yeah.
potential, but they have a lot of potential.
Yeah.
Like a very promising athlete who
Yes.
can turn into the next Michael Jordan, but they never do because
Yeah.
they're preoccupied with so many other issues.
Yeah. No, it reminds me of an Indian colleague I had at the London School of Economics, who in the 1980s, I used to call him you can't use language like this these days, but never mind. I used to call him the great brown hope of the new white left. He never achieved his potential.
Yeah, and very sadly, a lot of Indians who are smart and can contribute end up in other countries
Yeah.
for different reasons, and one of them is that they don't feel appreciated
Yeah.
within their country as well.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's very ironic and sad at the same time.
by the way, that's happening increasingly with mainland China. You have talented Chinese who are now desperate to go abroad, get qualified, and stay outside. But it has been more extreme with India. Another joke, you ask, let's say, an aspirational Indian, what is your favorite city in India? You know the answer? No? It's one of two. It's Dubai or Singapore. So, what is your favorite city in India? Anyway, so that's a story of, let's say, some achievement, but a lot of potential, and we'll see whether it's going to be realized. And this slide gives you an indication of living standards and how that's changed. So it's a similar story to the broad GDP story. Of course, Chinese living standards have skyrocketed. And of course, there's the growth slowdown now. Indian living standards have increased measurably. I mean, they're probably 4 to 5 times higher now than they were at the beginning of the reforms in the early 1990s, which is significant. And I mean, I'll show you a couple of charts on poverty reduction. In broad terms, over half the Indian population was in desperate poverty come 1990-91. That figure is now probably between 10 and 15%. It's been eliminated in China. It's 10 to 15% in India. Well, it's still a massive reduction. Which shows you the power of compound growth. 5%, 6% per annum translates into a rough doubling of living standards in a decade. And that sort of thing has happened in India. But again, note the gap with China. Chinese living standards are now 3 to 4 times higher than they are in India. So there's a snapshot of India in the world economy. Let me now say something about India's background and something briefly about the first 4 decades after independence. Independence in 1947, all the way up until the market reforms of 1991. And a couple of other speakers, Larry White and Doug Irwin, have mentioned this. India had something called the License Raj. So for most of that period, particularly from the mid-1950s until the late 1980s, and particularly when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister, India had a very, very interventionist economy. You had tariffs come 1991 that were over 100% on average. There were blanket bans on foreign investment. Someone mentioned that Coca-Cola wasn't available in India. There was a local variety, by the way, which wasn't too bad, but Coke wasn't in India until the 90s. You had the government controlling interest rates. You had several exchange rates controlled by the government. The financial sector was completely nationalized by the late 1960s. You had widespread nationalization of other sectors, particularly under Mrs. Gandhi. Most insane of all, precisely in the areas where you would expect India to have excelled at exports, like garments or furniture or leather goods, where you can employ lots of low-cost labor in factories, labor with not much education, and export to the world, precisely what China started doing from the late 1970s, early 1980s. Those sectors, for the best part of, for almost half a century, were reserved for small-scale cottage industries, which meant that the big companies with scale, who could build the big factories, weren't allowed to operate in these sectors, right? Which meant that what they concentrated on, the big Indian business houses like the Tatas and the Birlas and the Bajajas, they concentrated on domestic industries with a protected market that were essentially rent-seeking industries. They had guaranteed profits with little competition, partly not their fault because they weren't allowed to compete in, if you like, the internationally exposed industries. So just some examples of, and of course, most famously, you required a license or a permit to do absolutely anything, even to manufacture a golf ball. You needed to apply to the local department of your state government for the license to do so, and they would tell you how many you could produce, and they would also regulate prices and so on. There's a story that I've often used in lectures on India about the license Raj. It was a famous case in the 1980s. The law then, and the law still today, the Industrial Relations Act, I think it is, on the statute books since just after independence, stipulates that if you are a company that employs 100 or more people, to fire anyone, you have to apply to the Labor Department of your state government. So, there was one gentleman who was literally sleeping on the job at a company called Bharat Forge, which was part of a big conglomerate. And they wanted to fire him. So they applied to the local labor department, I forget in which state, to get him dismissed. The case took 27 years. So he was literally sleeping on the job for 27 years before the case was resolved. So you had those kinds of complications, which of course inevitably meant that businesses didn't invest, or they invested in less productive rather than more productive areas. And that's an indication of the license Raj. Indian foreign policy, if you like, was very much aligned with its economic policy at the time. So the rhetoric was very anti-Western, anti-American. India was one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, which had a very anti-Western slant. And India, crucially, had the Soviet Union as its first friend, as it were, because there was a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union from the mid-1960s. And India got its arms as well as cheap oil and other stuff from the Soviet Union. So that was foreign policy. The economy chugged along at growth rates of between 3 and 4% for those decades. Better than India's performance under the British, but of course way below its potential, and a huge gap opened up between the way India was performing and the East Asian miracle economies were performing. I have one chart here which tells this tale a little bit. During these years of the license Raj, in terms of the increase of living standards, that was India, right? About a 1% increase a year. And then a big jump with the opening of the economy. In terms of poverty, the poverty rate actually increased because the population was increasing exponentially. And the growth rate wasn't big enough to make a sufficient dent into poverty to bring the overall percentages down. So, more than half the population remained stuck in absolute poverty. No?
Growth was per capita, no?
That was growth by about 1%. Yeah.
So it's
but the
small and
population was about 400 million at independence. I guess by 1990 the population would have been around 1 billion plus.
I can see that.
Yeah.
the lessons for us. And you just suggested a labor law that this was terribly inefficient.
Still is.
Still is. Did the legislators provide any sort of economic justification for what they wrote, or did it just how it is?
No, you can explain this in, very standard, simple public choice terms. Of course, there was ideological cover for this. This was a way of protecting the workers against the predation, the exploitation of rapacious employers, and that sort of thing. The way it actually worked was that you had the government, in collusion with import substituting industries, capitalists, who had a guaranteed domestic market, and, if you like, a labor aristocracy. So a very small percentage of the working population is unionized. It's about 30 to 40 million people in India, out of a potential working population of 900 million, an actual working population of 400 million. So you're talking of about 5%, 5 to 10%, less than 10% of the Indian population that's unionized. But the unions are most powerful, and certainly were pre-91, precisely in the sectors that were the most protected and the most regulated. So these were the sectors with the higher paying jobs, where you couldn't fire anybody in the formal economy. And of course, it's a classic case of insiders protecting their livelihoods against outsiders. So you had a kind of iron triangle of capitalists, unions, and government, essentially having an iron cast on this law. And that law hasn't been changed, even after 30 years of reform. Well, yes. Employers have found ways of getting around it. There are exceptions. So, crucially, it doesn't apply in the new IT sectors. So, companies like Infosys and Tata don't have the same constraints. But for most of the economy, especially in all those labor-intensive sectors, I'm going to come to this story later, this still applies. And it's still a big constraint on India's growth potential, development potential. Okay. So that was known as the Hindu equilibrium. One economist, Deepak Lal, called this era, India's dismal economic performance, the Hindu equilibrium. So let's now come to the market reforms. And if we look at the politics or the political economy of it, here crisis plays an important role. If you look at most of the really big instances of market-led reform outside the West, or even in the West, what's really concentrated minds and got things moving is a crisis, an economic crisis, sometimes coupled with a political crisis. In India's case, there wasn't a political crisis, but there was an economic crisis. So the government had run up a lot of debt, including external debt, in the late 80s, which became unsustainable. The first Iraq war, the one over Kuwait, with oil prices going up, tipped it over the edge. India had to go to the IMF, negotiate a program. And that actually gave the cover for a group of domestic reformers to push through reforms that they'd been thinking about for some time. They didn't have the political opportunity before, but they did now, because the economy was in a state of crisis. So what you had was a relatively new Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, much undersung in the Indian story post-1990s, from the Congress Party, appointing a finance minister with extraordinary powers, that was Dr. Manmohan Singh, who in turn had a team of people who planned the reforms and pushed at least some of them through. And there was, if you like, an academic underpinning to this, because the reforms were underpinned by a very important paper commissioned by the government from two overseas Indian economists at Columbia University. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, who was Doug Irwin's teacher when he did his PhD at Columbia, and Professor Arvind Panagaria, who's still at Columbia University. And if you read that paper, there you have, if you like, the blueprint for the reforms that unfolded at least over the following decade. So what we saw then was, in that period of crisis, 2 years in particular, 91 to 93, by Indian standards, really big reforms, so-called Big Bang reforms. By the standards of some countries in Latin America or some countries in Eastern Europe, maybe not so Big Bang, but by Indian standards, revolutionary. So what you had was the dismantling of the license Raj, this whole permitting, this Byzantine permitting structure. You had tariffs that started to come down significantly, so that by a decade ago, they were only just above 10%, from over 100% in the early 90s. Foreign investment started to be allowed in, including Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola came back to India after a break of about 30 years, I think it was. I forget the brand. My Indian friends of a certain generation have.
I think it's the blue one.
Thumbs up.
What was it called, Larry? Tons Up. Tons Up. Yeah.
Get to the Africa. Now owned by Real.
Now owned by Coca-Cola. So, and if you look at the Indian economy now, you have a few sectors that are where you still have restrictions, but for most sectors, foreign investors can come in with 100% equity and full management control. So that's the difference compared with what existed before.
The mindset of the Indians has changed as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll come to that in a moment. Just to give you an indication of the reforms, that Small Scale Industries Act was also scrapped. So that allowed the big conglomerates to then move into areas that were more productive, and where they could operate at a bigger scale for international markets. The telecom sector was opened up in the late 1990s. The trigger for that was to remove a 50% tariff on the import of computers. Now, just think, you had a 50% markup on PCs back, say, in 1998, 1999. Of course, severely limiting processing power in India. When the minister at the time, who I got to know well afterwards, was persuaded that this was just insane, and he wasn't difficult to persuade. He had been a World Bank economist 30 years earlier, on the market side. Within no time, an IT services industry took off in India. Why? Because now you had a multiple of processing power, because it was cheaper. Simply by having PCs, which you paid 50% less for, whatever it was. And that gave the impetus for entrepreneurs, like the people who started up Infosys and Tata Consulting, to start an IT services industry that took off with the millennium bug in the year 1999 and 2000. And that's become the main engine of the Indian export industry since. But it all started with that removal of a 50% tariff. I'm going to come back to that story because the government has just done the exact reverse. I'll come to that a little later. So you have, that's just, in a nutshell. There are still state-owned banks in India, but early on in the reforms, the government opened up the financial sectors to the private sector. So now, I remember what I told you about the Chinese financial system and how repressed and regulated it is. The financial system in India is much more West-aligned and advanced and market-oriented than the financial system in China. And that's because most of the restrictions have been taken away. There are still state-owned banks, but you have a private sector, including some pretty productive private sector banks and insurers in India. Now, your question was, has this changed mentalities in India? I would give a clear yes to that. Yes, there's always room for improvement. The answer also depends on where you are, where you sit. So if you are in the state, then the answer is maybe not very much. The Indian state has not been reformed. You've had reforms done around the state without tackling reforms inside the state because that's been politically too difficult. But once you get outside the state and outside the public sector, into the Indian public sector, yes, I think that mindsets have changed enormously in the last generation and a half. So even if you look at India's top performing businesses, you look at the Tatas, the Adanis, the Reliance Industry, the Ambanis, and so on. Yes, they rely on government contacts. Yes, there's a lot of corruption. Yes, they have protected domestic sectors. But they are a lot more efficient than their parents and grandparents were. They produce stuff that Indian consumers actually want. They have link-ups with foreign companies. So you have that channel of foreign ideas and capital and technology coming through, all of that. The exemplar of this is the Tata Group, which is the emblematic Indian business. It's got a reputation for being clean, unlike most of the other business groups. It's owned by a tiny minority. There's a tiny minority, they're Parsis, originally from Persia, in Bombay. And if you look at what they do, starting with TCS, their IT consulting arm, all the way through to hotels, even to steel and cars. They operate around the world now, which they didn't 30, 40 years ago. They're much more productive and they provide much more value to the Indian consumer. Yes?
I want to add on something, like most of the Indians that I meet, especially here in the UAE, most of them are civil engineer, IT, like you said, and it's like they work here, but in a very lower cost with like, for example, my driver is a civil engineer. He was a civil engineer, but he didn't find the opportunity in India. Which, like how...
No, that's the other side of the coin, that the reforms have only gone so far. And one of my bullet points is that after the initial burst of reforms, there was a big reform pause. Then there was another burst under the first BJP government, late 1990s, early 2000s. And then essentially for the last 20 years, there haven't been, let's say, a critical mass of substantial economic reforms. So it's the lack of reforms that still means huge lack of opportunity for ordinary Indians. And it's a very differentiated picture. It depends where you go in India. In some parts of India, particularly if you're in the center or the north, the northeast, where there have been fewer reforms, where they're poorer to begin with, at one end of the spectrum, I know stories of Indians who spend months, if not years, dodging authorities, going from one European country to another, to finally end up in the UK to work on the black market, and living that kind of insecure existence because they don't see a future for themselves where they are, in their home village or wherever in India. Now that's true of some parts of India, though not of others. But I mean, lots of Indians in Singapore, as there are here in the UAE. It is a very common story in Singapore for employers to really like employing Indians with skills and qualifications compared with Singaporeans.
Because what I see, they have very labor because their salaries are less than other.
There's that, but there's also something else. There's the English language. I mean, for those, let's say, in the lower middle class and above, the skills they bring, their work ethic, their flexibility to do things in different ways. So all of those things are very much in demand in different parts of the world. Yes.
Does this have anything to do with their educational systems?
Yeah. It's
With like graduation and not after graduation, like high school, middle school,
teaching.
it's a schizophrenic system in India. So when it comes to the basics, to primary education, all the way up until school leaving age, India is terrible. It remains really bad. The public school system, the government school system is still terrible. It's not been reformed. Teachers get jobs because of political connections. Some of them don't even have qualifications to teach. Some of them don't even turn up to teach. I mean, when I've been walking or doing hiking in different parts of India, often you see children in schools doing nothing because the teacher isn't there. So what happens? Even poor people put their kids, with what little savings they have, into private schools. But half of the Indian school population is in private schools. And we're not talking expensive schools for the elite. But that's as a result of the shockingly bad state of the public school system. You have a similar story in healthcare. However, once you get to higher education, India also does very badly when it comes to vocational training, practical skills for people who are not going to become academics. The main university system is still pretty bad. But two things. From the 1950s, the government prioritized the institutes of technology, the IITs, and the institutes of management, essentially for the elite, right? And those are, on the whole, pretty good, some very good, some internationally well reputed. No, I mean, they get scholarships and all that, but it's these schools that produce the CEOs of Facebook, Microsoft, and so on. Because, of course, they become part of the diaspora, they go to Silicon Valley and elsewhere, they become the heads of McKinsey and leading law firms and so on, especially those from who have a training in the hard sciences. So you have that, and then also a bit of good news. In the last decade or so, the opening of private sector universities in India. The pioneering one is called Ashoka, just outside Delhi. The equivalent of it in South India is Kriya, which is up the coast north of Madras, Chennai. So you have these little pockets, as well as the IITs and the IIMs, but it's very lopsided because, what the East Asian countries did when they improved their education systems, they didn't start with elite universities for those in the upper middle class and above. They started by reforming education at primary level from the ages of 5 to 16 or whatever it was, which of course takes in the bulk of the population.
So when we copied the British system,
yeah, I mean they copied or carried on with some of the worst elements of the British system. Yeah,
in European flow, other the war, very good, but it didn't back to anymore.
Okay, so the cumulative effect, and I get back to. Let's start with this chart. I mean, you see a noticeable difference once the reforms kick in from the early 1990s, and this is not GDP, this is GDP per capita, it's living standards. You have the average increase jumping from 1.5% and 2.5% to 4% in the 90s, and then jumping even further to over 6%. And once you hit this figure, 6% plus per annum, you're talking about doubling living standards in a decade. The effect of compound growth. And that's what happened up until about a decade ago. So as a result of India's opening and globalization. And you see a corresponding effect in poverty. So poverty then goes from half the population to about 10% of the population by 20% of the population by 2011. And one crucial addition to this, poverty comes down wherever you look in India, in the urban areas, in the rural areas, in the north, the south, the east, and the west. And it also comes down among the least advantaged of Indians, among the so-called tribals and the lower castes. Massive reduction in poverty as a result of the growth generated by the reforms. Okay, so that takes me through to the last decade, which is what I'm going to focus on from now. India had a crucial general election in, I think it was April 2014, so almost 10 years ago. The previous government of the Congress Party, which had ruled India for most of the years post-independence, had been stagnating. There were corruption scandals. It hadn't done any serious reforms. Because the growth rates were high as a result of previous reforms, it had a lot of revenue to distribute. So there was a lot of redistribution and very inefficient distribution in the name of improving education, healthcare, and social security. But of course, the result of these growth rates is that India had developed a new middle class outside the traditional middle class. In other words, a bulging lower middle class of aspirational young people who wanted more. And they were fed up with what was happening at the time. By that time, the main opposition party, the BJP, had been taken over by Narendra Modi, the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And Gujarat is one of India's best performing states on the west coast. He had established a record of very good economic record, particularly by getting foreign investment in for some major projects. The government was efficient by Indian standards. There was higher growth, lower poverty, and all that. And on the basis of his record, he took over the BJP and he campaigned for this election. And this election, I'm dwelling on this a little because it was a genuine economic choice. Rarely do you have elections where you have a clear choice between, let's say, a dirigiste platform and a pro-market platform. This election presented such a choice because the incumbent government, led by the Congress Party, said, we're going to do more of the same. Growth is going to continue at 6% plus. We're not really interested in further market reforms. What we're interested in is more and more efficient redistribution, particularly to healthcare and education, and that will equip us for sustainable growth in the future. That was their argument. And their argument was given, if you like, an academic foundation by two prominent economists. Professor Amartya Sen, winner of the Nobel Prize at Harvard University, and his long-term collaborator, Professor Jean Drèze from Belgium, used to teach at my university, the LSE, and who was a key advisor to the last Congress government. So that was their position. Now, Mr. Modi, coming from Gujarat, struck out a very clear pro-market position. And what he said was that India needed not track 2, but track 1 reforms. It needed further market reforms to deliver higher growth, to reduce poverty, in support of all these aspirational Indians who want to get into the middle class, who want to get out of poverty. And he said he was going to take the tough decisions that hadn't been taken before. His soundbite was minimum government, maximum governance. Again, this had academic underpinning because very much in support of the Modi platform were two prominent economists. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, who was the co-author of that report I mentioned earlier, and Professor Arvind Panagaria, who subsequently became the head of the government's think tank. And they became quite partisan in support of Modi and the BJP, advocating those track 1 market reforms. Trade liberalization, domestic deregulation, deregulating the labor laws, among other things. So that was the election. Mr. Modi won with his allies, with a landslide majority. They formed the new government. So there was a clear mandate for these reforms. Mohammed?
Just a quick follow-up. So one of the topics that economists agree on is free trade, I assume.
Not necessarily.
So why did the Sen and Drees
No, it was...
disagree with the Bhagwati and Panagaria?
I think on the trade issue, I don't think there was a fundamental disagreement of principle. It was a case of different priorities. So Bhagwati Panagaria emphasized very much further trade and investment liberalization. Sen and Drèze said, okay, well, we're not against reversing the existing reforms, but further reforms on this track are not a priority for us. We want to concentrate the government's attention on things like healthcare and education. Right? That was the basic difference.
Is there a reason for focusing on healthcare and education?
No, the argument being that India really needed to pay more attention to improving basic skills as well as basic welfare, including healthcare, and that a better educated and a healthier population would also be an economically more productive population. That was the basic argument.
But this was the incumbent government. Why didn't they do that?
They didn't. I mean, they threw money at the problem without changing. Because the politics of, as well as the ideology of changing the delivery mechanism, including private sector participation, is of course another thing from just throwing money at the issue. So that was 2014. What we've seen, certainly from a market perspective, with Modi and the BJP in government now for almost a decade, having won another landslide victory in 2019 with an absolute majority for the BJP on its own, not needing its coalition partners. Clear mandate, but that mandate has not been exercised. Rather, what we've seen is a turn to both more illiberal politics and illiberal economics. So, from a market perspective, it's been a big disappointment because all those promised reforms from 2014, 90% of them have not really been enacted. Why? And how does that reflect in India's performance? And what does that tell us about India's prospects is really what I'm going to address from now on. Let me start with the politics and the decision making. You have a one-man show in Delhi now, which is Mr. Modi, and he's very much a showman. Decision making is highly centralized. The cabinet is full of yes men and at least one yes woman, who is the Minister of Finance. The BJP now controls most of the state governments. The legislatures, starting with the union legislature in Delhi, are basically rubber stamp forums. It's the executive that has supreme power, if you like. The government, this is unusual for India. Mrs. Gandhi tried to turn India into an illiberal democracy. She imposed an emergency for 2 years. But it didn't work because, and this was the conventional view, it was even my view going back 10 years ago, that India is so diverse, it's so plural, it's so full of checks and balances, both formal and informal, it will prevent one person or one party from monopolizing power. And that was the thinking when Modi and the BJP took over. But what they've done is erode those checks and balances. They've taken over the institutions. Even the Supreme Court is pliant these days. It's not independent the way it used to be. Modi's number two, who I wouldn't like to meet in a dark alley in the middle of the night, the Minister for Home Affairs, is, if you like, the person who sticks the knife in. So what you have now in India is a kind of culture of fear, a lot of self-censorship. The universities are no longer free. The think tanks are no longer free. The media is no longer free. There is a fear culture. There are consequences to expressing your view if it's different from the government. There is an us and them attitude. Often what happens is, if you express an alternative view as a professor, as someone in a think tank, or as a newspaper columnist, the tax authorities will go after you and find something wrong and you'll go to jail. So that, of course, encourages self-censorship. So you have this creeping into India now, and it's become pervasive, which wasn't the case for most of the decades, nearly all the years after independence.
What do you mean by us and them?
No, so, this is what we say as the government. You agree with us, you promote our message, and if you don't, then, well, you can retire to a village somewhere or to your fancy house and not say anything. That's fine by us. But don't make trouble, because if you make trouble for us, we will make much more trouble for you. And we will use the state to do that. So you have that now happening in India. In other words, a very selective rule of law. It's not unprecedented in India by any stretch. It's just now being done more systematically than before. So you have a weakening of independent institutions and civil society. The government can declare anyone to be a terrorist, by the way, and get away with it. About 17,000 organizations have either ceased to exist or been refused renewal as, if you like, NGOs or assorted civil society organizations, particularly if there's any foreign link, foreign funding. Centralized power, top-down governance, and then crucially, the so-called Hindutva ideology. Now, the BJP's core ideology outside economics is Hindu majoritarianism. India is not a multiracial secular country, which was the governing ideology of the Congress Party post-independence. Rather, India's Hindu majority should mean that it's a Hindu country, and the minorities are there at the sufferance of the Hindu majority. So you have more ideology and rhetoric along these lines. That's come to the top of the agenda, often crowding out the economic reforms. And it's led to a lot of judicial as well as extrajudicial persecution, even violence, against Muslims in particular. And that's 200 million Indians, 15% of the population. Christians to some extent as well. So you have that divide in India, which is now worse than at probably any time since independence, by playing that religious card. A couple of charts here which show Freedom House now ranks India alongside Hungary as a partly free country and an illiberal democracy. And there's been a marked decline in civil liberties. That said, I don't want to sound like a New York Times columnist, because when the New York Times reports on India, it's all about this and nothing about anything else. There are, of course, other parts of the picture. So in some respects, this government is definitely more efficient than its predecessor. Now, Mr. Modi's record was getting projects done in Gujarat. And that's what he does in Delhi. It's a project, it's very Chinese in one respect, and he admires the Chinese for this in particular. You attract big investment, and the government then enables big projects to get done in the service of the people. And he's been much more efficient doing that with that very centralized way of doing government, and with less corruption than the Congress Party before. So we see more bigger projects getting done, some of them with big ticket foreign investment. Generally lesser corruption. It's not to say corruption has gone away. So if some of you might see in the headlines, there's a group called the Adani Group, which is has probably been doing some rather inventive stuff with accounting procedures in particular. Indian regulators have been silent. It's been exposed from outside India. Oh, the Adani Group, they're about to have a port operation in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. Yes, so it's one of India's biggest conglomerates, very close to Modi. Mr. Adani comes from Gujarat and is one of the big financiers of the party. So you have, if you like, the state and regulators turning a blind eye to business groups that are close to the government, which again is not new in India. Now, some of the downsides of centralized government is that arbitrary decisions, maybe sometimes they get it right, but sometimes they get it very wrong indeed. So there was a very sudden decision announced to demonetize the Indian rupee, to chop several noughts off it a few years ago, which had really bad consequences, particularly for small and medium-sized industries. And then India made a real mess of its COVID policies, particularly the first and the second lockdowns. And that hit the poorest parts of the population worst. So if we come to the Modi record, I would sum it up this way. Trying to be balanced about it. The hardware is better. And if you go to India, you'll see what I mean. If you go to India, let's say for the second time, you'll see what I mean. If you go for the first time, you might think the infrastructure is terrible, everything's creaking, everything's backward. But I spent a month in India earlier this year. It was my first visit post-COVID. It was my first visit to the north in probably 7 or 8 years. And what I saw was significant difference. The roads are much, much better. India now builds about 10,000 kilometers of new roads every year. It's a huge road building program stretching to the poorest and remotest parts of India. The rail network is improving at last. There's a new high-speed connection between Bombay in Maharashtra and Ahmedabad, the capital of Gujarat. It's cut traveling time in half. Other rail tracks, rail services are being improved. The number of airports in India has doubled in the last 10 years. I mean, I went to some remote parts of India in February, in the north, in UP and Bihar, and also in Maharashtra. And even in a second or third tier city like Aurangabad, which is on the western side of Maharashtra, you go there if you want to go to the caves of Ajanta and Ellora. The airport looks better than Heathrow or Gatwick in the UK. So distinct improvement. The digital infrastructure is also improving by leaps and bounds. You have about 800 million connections in India now. It was about 60 million 10 years ago. They have a new, it's called the UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, which is an open platform. Lots of different private sector services can plug into it, unlike what you see in China. That accounts for about a half of digital transactions. So that's one thing. The infrastructure record is a lot better. Benny? Some of the toilets are improving. Yeah, I mean, there's room for improvement, as I saw in UP and Bihar. But yes, definitely an improvement.
Improved there.
Yeah.
Lower disease.
Yeah. And on the welfare side, India has a very inefficient welfare state. It's expanding under Congress and also now under the BJP. The difference is this. You now have, thanks to Mr. Nandan Nilekani, one of the founders of Infosys, something called an Aadhaar. It's a biometric card with a chip. And you can get your government welfare through that, which has also been an incentive to open about 500 million new bank accounts in India. And you can, let's say the woman of the household can get her welfare payment that way, rather than going through a middleman who'll take his cut, which is the way it used to be done. So the government has something called an India stack of basically welfare services through government organizations, which now operates electronically. So that's made let's say welfare is now, because of that, less inefficient than it used to be. So that's on the plus side. Some good policies, big corporate tax reform, bankruptcy law, and crucially, a nationwide sales tax. And what that nationwide sales tax has done is basically come close to getting rid of internal barriers in India, because there used to be a time, when I crossed a state border, when I had to wait a long time, because it was like a national border. And if you were a truck with goods, it was much worse. Often you had to wait hours and days. Now you go straight across a straight border, because this national sales tax has replaced the other stuff that states had separately. But still big hardware and software deficits, not a big market reform record. So protectionism has increased. I'm coming to that. You have a more industrial policy. You still have the same labor laws. It's still difficult to acquire land in India, and a host of other doing business problems in India. So as a result of that, what we see is a growth performance which is, it's good by Western standards, but still bad, not very much under potential by Indian standards. So a growth slowdown pre-COVID, then you had a huge reduction, 7% contraction in output, I think in the first or the second year of COVID. A strong rebound afterwards. India is probably growing around 6 to 7%, but it's an unequal rebound because some sectors of the population are benefiting much more than others, partly as a result of the COVID legacy. Now, this chart from McKinsey Global Institute gives you an indication of the difference between potential and actuality. So what the McKinsey economists tell us is that India's potential growth rate, if sufficient reforms are done, is about 8 to 9% a year, right? And if you get to that level of growth, you're talking about a significant increase in productivity as well as a significant increase in employment, right? In a high growth scenario. And India needs to produce about 100 million jobs because of its demographic bulge, particularly in the poorer parts of the country. But if growth is stuck around 5 to 6%, lower productivity and hardly any increase in net employment, that's the key difference between 5% and 8-9% rates of growth. And you see that reflected in the following charts. India's labor force participation rate is low and declining, right? And particularly in its poorer states like Uttar Pradesh, 220 million population. On its own, it would be one of the biggest countries in the world. And that deficient labor force participation rate you see particularly among women. It was already low, and it's getting lower. See the contrast between India and Bangladesh. All those women from villages going to work in garments factories. That accounts for a lot of that in Bangladesh, but not happening in India. Incomes have diverged sharply during the pandemic, affecting particularly these sections here, the poorest parts of the population. Okay. Now, I want to talk about India in the world economy a bit more specifically, and let me check time. We've got 15 minutes. So I had better crack on because Daniela is a very strict timekeeper. Okay. Now, there's a very interesting story here and not to India's advantage. So let me start with the positive part of the story. Because of India's liberalization, and I mentioned two headline examples, the tariff rate coming way down and opening up to foreign investment, India actually has a creditable success story on trade if you look at it at first blush. Right. So, India's ratio of trade to GDP is now about 50%, which is higher than China's. It's a much more open economy. Look where it was pre-1991. Yeah? And if you look at particular sectors, India is doing pretty well, even compared with Vietnam and China. Growth rates on exports overall, even of manufactured goods overall. Right? But here's where the story moves from being positive to negative. Right? And look at this chart here. Now, what this chart shows us is relative success or failure when it comes to low-skill exports of manufacturers in particular. In other words, labor-intensive manufactured products. Now, going back to what Doug Irwin told us about comparative advantage. Right. India's comparative advantage, very clearly, is what China's comparative advantage was 30 years ago. Right. It's poor people in the countryside, especially young people, with little or no education. And the best opportunity would be for them to go into factory jobs in urban or urbanizing areas, particularly jobs in companies that export. Higher levels of productivity, also higher wages, and with the technology and ideas coming from the West and elsewhere. That's what China did, and then moved up the value chain, as did the other East Asian countries. That is precisely what India is not doing. And this chart tells that tale, because here it shows China's success, Vietnam's success, Bangladesh doing pretty well, but India falling way back. Here, for example, where is India doing well in exports? In services, IT services. All very well, but the IT service sector employs 5 million people in India out of a working population of 400 million. India is also doing well in high-skill manufacturing exports, pharmaceuticals, for example. Okay, doesn't employ that many people because it's capital intensive. It's not labor intensive. Where India is doing really badly is in agriculture, still unreformed, and low-skill manufacturing. The performance has actually got worse over time. It's not producing garments, leather goods, footwear, furniture, that sort of thing in quantity. And at a time when that kind of production is moving out of China, where is it moving to? It's moving to Vietnam, it's moving to Bangladesh, it's not moving to India, even though India's potential is much bigger because it has a much bigger population. So precisely in the areas where India should be doing well in international trade, especially in terms of employment generation, it's not doing well at all. It's doing well in other areas. And that's the key difference on the trade and globalization front between India and East Asia, or even between India and Bangladesh. And that in turn goes back to reforms not being done in key areas, like the labor laws, like the tariffs, like a few areas of foreign investment, but it's mainly the behind-the-border issues to do with domestic business regulation. Yeah. India has grown without industrializing. Manufacturing is still stuck. It's declined to about 13% of GDP. It's double that in China. No. So that tells a very important story. Now, Funny.
India has one of the fastest productivity growth in the world because of what you're talking about. Where the labor market's not going and the economy is growing 7-8%.
Yeah.
And what we understand from what we see in the venture capital world is that a lot of the entrepreneurs in India are software people who are moving over to manufacturing, but their business models are here putting in really advanced equipment that you would find in Europe or you would find in North America from the get.
Yeah. The problem is, of course, they're employing robots. They're not employing people from the countryside. That's the key issue.
The apples that are going into their manufacturing are working hand in glove with that. So that they can actually, the game plan is basically to undercut China by unit costs. And by doing this, they're actually beginning to show progress.
Don?
I heard about an agricultural reform and a lot of protest from farmers.
So the one of the few reforms the government seemed to be willing to undertake was the reform of agriculture, much needed, because it's even worse than the common agricultural policy in the European Union, by some measure. I won't go into the detail. But because of huge protests from some very organized groups, farmers in some key states, the government withdrew them. It just gave way completely.
What they want to do to reduce subsidies?
To reduce subsidies, to remove essentially laws that protected middlemen, to move to more market pricing, to have a much better cold chain, all of those things. But none of that's materialized. Okay. Now I will press on because there are one or two key points I want to get through before Daniela gets up and dismisses us from the room. So now this gets to the policy debate today, and it's one of the key policy debates in India, which reflects what's happening in the rest of the world. So given the story I just presented, one set of people, including some pro-market economists, say, for India to really develop and achieve its potential, it needs to follow that East Asian path. There is no substitute. You have to do those reforms to get manufacturing into India, into the most productive, labor-intensive areas, and align it with exports and foreign investment. Right? Otherwise, you're simply not going to generate enough jobs. The alternative, and this is the government's argument, is no. Service is good. High-skill manufacturing is good. But what we need to do is really boost manufacturing in India, make in India, the slogan, but for India. In other words, domestic production for domestic consumption. That's the argument. And we're going to supercharge industrial policy to attract the investment to do this while retaining or even increasing the protection we have, right? So that these industries get promoted. So we have this mercantilist slant to policy that's become entrenched. So turning inward under Modi, that swing to mercantilism, a return to protectionism. Tariff rates have actually gone up in India. They're now close to 20%. they've gone up particularly in those labor-intensive areas, like garments. So India arguably is shooting itself in the foot and learning the long lessons from the East Asian miracle, rather than getting into those global value chains where it's weak. It's keeping out of those value chains because it's increasing the barriers at the border, never mind what's happening inside the border. So you have that. India has stopped signing free trade agreements. It stayed out of the free trade agreement, which is pan-Asian, particularly because it's scared of Chinese imports. Industrial policy is on the rise. You have a $40 billion program to target, I think it's about 14 sectors, subsidies plus external protection, which brings me back to the PC story. You now need a license to import PCs and tablets again. Right. Why? Because they're promoting a domestic industry, especially the politically favored domestic incumbents, like the Reliance Group. What does that mean? Apple now needs to get licenses to import PCs into India, as does Samsung, and assorted tablets. Good news for Indian value chains in consumer electronics? Obviously not. Promoting national champions, particularly the Adani's group and the Reliance Group, very much linked in with the BJP and with Mr. Modi in particular. Potential, of course, for lots of corruption there. So there's a worrying concentration of economic power. The danger is that 5 to 6% rates of growth are going to go to an already established elite who dominate capital-intensive and skill-intensive parts of the economy, but are not going to go sufficiently to, if you like, that lumpen proletariat of those in the countryside who need jobs in manufacturing or wherever. And India is failing to take advantage of globalization. Other issues which I don't have time to go into, including unreformed agriculture and the service sector outside the IC sector, which is 95% of the Indian services economy. And that's informal, by the way. It's not in the formal economy. 90% of Indian output is outside the formal economy, which means workers have no protection. They have no pensions. They can be hired and fired any time, because formally they're not employed. And they're employed by small-scale employers, who operate from day to day. There's no scale, there's no investment, there's no training. And that's the lot still of the majority of Indian workers. Politics and governance. I want to say something about this before I close in the next 5 minutes. The most difficult country in the world to govern, far more difficult than China, because India is much more diverse, ethnically, religiously, culturally. And it's a democracy. It's a federal system, crucially. India has a peculiar form of federalism. A lot of it involves this concurrent list where the union government and the state governments have to cooperate on some very important infrastructural issues in particular. India is it's difficult to generalize about India in one sense because it's this. The rich south and west, and these are the states that have done best since 1991. From Tamil Nadu to the other states of South India, that's 300 million people, through Maharashtra with Mumbai, it's India's business capital, to the state of Gujarat. This is India's best performing part. And then you have much poorer India here, the so-called cow belt, in the center and parts of the east, much, much poorer. These states, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, account for between them about 350 million people, still very poor. Now the problem is this: the demographic bulge in India, the growing population, is not happening here because they're already more advanced. Mothers are having fewer children. They're better educated. There's better healthcare. There's generally better government. There's more efficient industry and services. It's here. So the challenge is, how do you provide the jobs for all those scores and even hundreds of millions of youngsters coming onto the labor market in these poorly performing states, which have not really industrialized? Right? That's the key. Demography I talked about. Other issues, foreign policy and geopolitics, I don't have time to talk about here. But just a final concluding comment. Looking forward, even if India is growing at 5 to 6%, and it doesn't have a social explosion, in a few decades, it'll be a much bigger economy than it is now, and an economy with much more clout in the world. It's not part of that select big three, because its economy is much smaller. At the moment, it's the US, the European Union, and China. But going forward to 2050 and beyond, India will be there or thereabouts. It will, in that sense, have much more of an impact on the rest of the world. And with that might come political or geopolitical power. Might, I'd say. It's not an automatic translation. So India is certainly not to be dismissed. And I think we're 2 minutes. Well, sorry for bombarding you with points, just to get my points through. But anyone want to raise a quick point or two before we close? Or have I stunned you into silence? Yes, Maya.
Why is Saudi going inwards? Is there any economic reason for this? Is he backed up by Indian economists or other economists?
I think it's part of a worldwide trend. So some of the reasons are domestic. It's ideologically driven. And that kind of economic nationalism is a very strong, potent force in India, always has been, since independence. So he's just running with that. It's also part of a worldwide trend. This is happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in China. So he's following that trend as well. I think it's a combination of the two. It's also politically, he thinks it's politically advantageous alongside his Hindutva agenda.